I remember the exact smell of the kitchen that morning. It was a mixture of freshly ground coffee and the lavender wax I used to polish the mahogany table where we sat for 22 years, building a life out of shared glances and whispered dreams. My name is Elena, and for the longest time, I believed I was the architect of a perfect world. My husband, Julian, was the foundation. Our home wasn't just a structure of bricks and mortar. It was a sanctuary, a testament to a love that had weathered the storms of youth to settle into a golden, peaceful middle age. Then there was Sarah, if Julian was the foundation. Sarah was the light that filtered through the windows. We had been best friends since our university days. She was the person who held my hair back when I was sick, the one who caught my tears when my father passed away, and the first person I called when I found out I was pregnant with my daughter, Maya. Sarah never married. She said she never found a love like ours, and I, in my infinite naivety, felt a sense of protective pride over her. I wanted her to share in our warmth. I invited her to every dinner, every holiday, every quiet Sunday afternoon. Our home was her home. I remember telling her once, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, that no matter what happened in the world, she would always have a place at our table. I didn't realize then that she wasn't just looking for a place at the table, she was looking for my chair. The beginning of the end was draped in the most beautiful mundane details. Julian would come home from the firm, his tie loosened, and the first thing he would ask was, "Is Sarah coming over for dinner?" I thought it was kindness. I thought he cared for her because I cared for her. We were a trio, an inseparable unit of trust. I remember the way the light hit the crystal glasses during those evenings. We laughed about old stories, about the time we got lost in Italy, or the way Julian tried to cook a Thanksgiving turkey that ended up being charcoal. It was also safe. There is a specific kind of blindness that comes with deep, long-term security. You stop looking for shadows when you believe the sun will never set. I spent my days tending to the garden, ensuring the hydrangeas were vibrant and the hedges were clipped. I wanted everything to be beautiful for them, for my family. I took pride in being the glue. Sarah would often come over early, helping me chop vegetables, her hands moving with a familiarity in my kitchen that I found comforting. She knew where the salt was kept, which burner on the stove was temperamental, and exactly how Julian liked his steak. "You're so lucky, Elena," she would whisper, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Julian and me on our wedding day. "You have everything." I would hug her, smelling her expensive perfume scent I would later learn to loathe, and tell her that her time would come. I was so busy being a savior that I didn't see I was being replaced, one shared recipe and one lingering look at a time. The perfection was a shroud. It was a heavy, silken veil that kept me from seeing the way Julian's eyes stayed on her a second too long when she laughed, or the way Sarah began to dress in colors that she knew Julian admired. I was focused on the harmony, on the symphony of a well-lived life, unaware that the musicians had already changed the tune behind my back. My home was a masterpiece of my own creation, and I was inviting the person who would eventually burn it down to stay for dessert. The shift didn't happen with a loud crash. It happened in the silences. It started with the way Julian began to leave his phone face down on the nightstand, a small, insignificant gesture that, in the context of 20 years, felt like a locked door appearing, where there had always been an open archway. I remember lying awake beside him, the moonlight cutting a silver path across our duvet, and feeling a strange, cold current in the air. He was right there, his shoulder inches from mine, but his spirit seemed to be wandering in a landscape I could no longer see. When I would reach out to touch him, he would shift in his sleep, a subtle recoil that felt like a needle to my heart. "I'm just tired, Elena," he would say the next morning, his eyes avoiding mine as he adjusted his cufflinks. "The mergers and acquisitions case is draining me." I chose to believe him because the alternative was a cliff I wasn't ready to jump from. Then there were the invitations. Sarah started coming over without me asking. At first, it felt like the natural progression of our friendship, but the rhythm of her presence began to change. She no longer sat across from us. She sat closer to Julian's side of the table. One evening, as I was bringing out the roast chicken, I caught them in the middle of a laugh that died the moment I entered the room. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was an intimate, shared vibration that left a bitter taste in my mouth. "What's the joke?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, the wooden handle of the serving spoon feeling heavy in my hand. "Oh, just something from work," Sarah replied, smoothing her skirt. She had started working as a consultant for Julian's firm 3 months prior, a move I had encouraged, thinking it would be wonderful for her career. Now, that decision felt like I had personally handed her the keys to my husband's time. I began to notice the small, terrifying synchronization between them. They started using the same phrases, sharing inside jokes about clients I didn't know, and even their body language seemed to mirror each other. If Julian leaned back, Sarah would follow suit seconds later. It was a dance I wasn't invited to. I felt like a ghost in my own living room, a spectator watching a play where the lead actress had been recast without any notice. One afternoon, I found a silk scarf on the passenger seat of Julian's car. It wasn't mine. It was a deep emerald green, the exact color Sarah wore, to highlight her eyes. When I asked him about it, his face didn't pale, it turned stony. She left it there when I gave her a ride to the station after the meeting. "Don't be so paranoid, Elena. It's unbecoming." That word unbecoming stung more than the scarf. It was a dismissal of my intuition, a way of telling me that my feelings were a flaw in my character. The distance grew in the spaces between words. Our conversations, once deep rivers of shared thoughts, became shallow puddles of logistics. We talked about the bills, the garden, and Maya's upcoming graduation, but we no longer talked about us. Every time I tried to bridge the gap, Sarah's name would inevitably come up. Julian would praise her efficiency, her sharp mind, her refreshing perspective on things. I began to feel old, stagnant, like a piece of furniture that had been in the room so long it was no longer noticed. I would stand in front of the hallway mirror after they left for late-night strategy sessions, searching my face for the woman Julian used to adore. I saw the fine lines around my eyes, the silver strands in my hair, and I wondered if the perfection I had built was actually a prison I had constructed for myself. The signs were all there, written in the way he stopped noticing my new dresses and started noticing every word Sarah spoke. I was losing him, and the most painful part was that my best friend was the one leading him away, and she was doing it with a smile that I still, desperately, wanted to trust. I became a master of the lie. Not the kind of lie you tell others, but the kind you tell yourself every morning just to be able to stand up and face the mirror. I told myself that 22 years of history couldn't be erased by a green scarf or a shared glance. I doubled down on my devotion. I started waking up at 5 in the morning to prepare Julian's favorite breakfast, the elaborate French toast with cinnamon, and the specific brand of coffee he liked, hoping that if I made the nest warm enough, the bird wouldn't want to fly away. I was sacrificing my pride, my rest, and my intuition at the altar of a marriage that was already hollowed out. I remember Sarah coming over and seeing the effort I was putting in. She would tilt her head, pity in her eyes, and say, "You're such a saint, Elena. I don't know how you do it all." It felt like a taunt disguised as a compliment, but I just smiled and offered her a cup of coffee. Denial is a heavy cloak. It keeps you warm, but it weighs you down until you can barely breathe. I started going to church again, sitting in the back pew, praying for a strength I didn't have and for a clarity I was actually terrified to receive. I made deals with God in the silence of that sanctuary. If I become a better wife, if I lose 10 pounds, if I stop complaining about his late nights, then everything will go back to the way it was. I was convinced that the problem was me. It had to be me. Because if the problem was Julian, my world was over. If the problem was Sarah, my past was a lie. So, I took the blame upon myself like a crown of thorns. I organized a surprise anniversary party for our 23rd year, spending weeks obsessing over every detail, every flower arrangement, every guest list. I wanted to prove to the world and to the woman standing in my kitchen that we were untouchable. During the planning of that party, the denial reached its peak. I found a receipt for a jewelry store in Julian's coat pocket while I was taking it to the dry cleaners. My heart leapt into my throat. A diamond pendant. I spent 3 days in a state of euphoric delusion, convinced that he had bought it for our anniversary. I imagined him presenting it to me, tears in his eyes, apologizing for the distance of the past few months. I even practiced my reaction, the way I would forgive him instantly, the way we would laugh about my silly suspicions. I used that receipt as a shield. Whenever I felt a pang of jealousy, when I saw him texting her, I would whisper to myself, "He bought the necklace. He bought the necklace." It was my mantra. I was willing to ignore the fact that he hadn't touched me in months, that he barely looked at me when I spoke, all because of a piece of paper that promised a return to the perfect beginning. I even tried to save Sarah. I convinced myself that she was lonely and that her attachment to my husband was just a misplaced desire for the stability we represented. I tried to set her up with Julian's colleagues, hosting dinner parties where I played the perfect matchmaker. I would watch her across the table, leaning into Julian to whisper something, while the man I had chosen for her sat ignored. My heart would hammer against my ribs, a frantic warning, but I would simply pour more wine and laugh a little louder. I was sacrificing my own dignity to maintain the illusion of a friendship that was already a corpse. I was so afraid of the void that I preferred to live in a house of mirrors, where every reflection was a distorted version of the truth I was too weak to face. I believed that if I just held on tight enough, if I sacrificed enough of my soul, the universe would have no choice but to reward my faith. I didn't realize that you can't save a ship that the captain is actively trying to sink. The anniversary party was supposed to be my triumph, the night the world witnessed the strength of our bond. I had spent thousands of dollars on catering. The garden was illuminated by hundreds of fairy lights, and I wore a silk dress, the color of moonlight, waiting for the moment Julian would present me with that diamond pendant. But the night didn't end with a celebration. It ended with a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Julian was late. He was late to his own anniversary party. I moved among the guests, a glass of champagne trembling in my hand, repeating the same practiced lines. He's just finishing up a closing at the office. You know how he is. But as the hours ticked by, the pity in my friend's eyes became unbearable. Sarah was also missing. She had sent a text saying she had a migraine and couldn't make it. Around 11 p.m., when most of the guests had filtered out with awkward excuses, I decided to go to the office. I told myself I was worried that maybe there had been an accident, but deep down, the voice I had been drowning out for months was screaming. When I arrived at the firm, the building was nearly dark, save for the warm glow coming from Julian's corner office on the top floor. My hand shook as I pressed the elevator button. The silence of the hallway was heavy, the air conditioning humming like a low, persistent growl. I didn't knock. I don't know why, but I simply turned the handle. The door creaked open just an inch, and that was all it took for my entire life to collapse. There was no paperwork on the desk. There were no merger documents. There was only Julian, and there was Sarah. They weren't just talking. She was wearing the diamond pendant, the one I had pinned all my hopes on. It caught the light of the desk lamp, sparkling against her skin, as she laughed that same intimate, vibrating laugh I had heard in my kitchen. Julian's hands, the hands that had held mine at the altar, were cupping her face with a tenderness he hadn't shown me in years. "I can't keep doing this, Julian," she whispered, though she didn't move away. "Elena deserves to know." And then he spoke, and his words were the blades that finally finished me. "I know. But how do you tell someone that the life you built was just a comfortable habit? I don't love her, Sarah. I haven't for a long time. You're the only thing that makes me feel alive." I didn't scream. I didn't burst in and throw the champagne bottle I was still inexplicably holding. I simply stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, my back hitting the cold glass of the partition. The shock was so physical, I felt my lungs seize. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the casual execution of my identity. To them, I was a comfortable habit. I was the gardener of a life they were both enjoying, while planning to leave me in the ruins. I watched through the crack as he kissed her a long, slow kiss that carried the weight of 1,000 betrayals. Every meal I had cooked, every prayer I had whispered in that back pew, every sacrifice I had made to be perfect disintegrated in that moment. My best friend wasn't just stealing my husband. She was wearing the trophy of my humiliation around her neck. I turned and walked toward the elevator, my movements mechanical, my mind a white-hot void of agony. The woman who entered that building was a wife. The woman who left it was a ghost. I didn't leave the building. I stood by the elevator for what felt like an eternity, watching the floor numbers blur through a veil of cold, silent tears. But then, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, a raw, jagged spark of indignation ignited in my chest. I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. I turned back. This time, I didn't peek through the crack. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with a force that made them slam against the inner walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent office. They sprang apart instantly. Sarah's hand went to the diamond pendant at her throat, her eyes widening in a terror that I found, for a fleeting second, deeply satisfying. Julian's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, guilt, and then, most devastatingly, a cold, hard defensive wall. "Elena," he said, his voice stripped of the warmth he had just given Sarah. "What are you doing here?" The audacity of the question nearly choked me. I walked toward the desk, every step feeling like I was treading on broken glass. I looked at Sarah, the woman who had sat at my table, drank my wine, and listened to my deepest fears. "Is it comfortable, Sarah?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "The necklace, does it feel like a reward for 20 years of friendship? Or is it just a down payment on the life you're trying to take from me?" She couldn't look at me. She looked at the floor, her shoulders trembling, playing the role of the fragile victim even now. "Elena, it's not what it looks like," she whimpered. I laughed, then a hollow, jagged sound. Don't insult my intelligence along with my heart. I heard you. I heard everything. I turned to Julian. He was standing tall, trying to regain his professional composure, but his hands were shaking as he straightened his tie. "You were a habit, Julian. Is that all I am? The person who raised your child, who built your home, who stood by you when you had nothing. I'm just a routine you got bored with." He didn't deny it. He looked at me with a clinical kind of pity that was worse than anger. "We grew apart, Elena. We've been living in a museum of a marriage for years. You were so obsessed with making everything look perfect that you stopped noticing I wasn't happy." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. He was blaming me for my own blindness, blaming my devotion for his betrayal. "I wasn't obsessed with perfection, Julian," I whispered, the tears finally breaking through. "I was obsessed with you. I was obsessed with the promise we made. And you didn't even have the courage to leave before you brought her into our bed, into our lives." The confrontation moved from the office to the raw center of our shared history. I told them about the anniversary party, about the guests who had seen my humiliation, about the food that was rotting on the table at home while they celebrated my replacement. Sarah tried to speak, to offer some twisted justification about finding a soulmate, but I silenced her with a look of such pure loathing that she actually recoiled. You didn't find a soulmate, Sarah. You found a shortcut. You didn't want to build a life. You wanted to move into one that was already finished. I looked at them both, standing there in the wreckage of my world. I realized then that the man I loved was already dead, and the woman I trusted had never existed. I took off my wedding ring, the gold band, that felt like a hot iron on my skin, and placed it on the desk between them. "Here," I said, my voice finally breaking. "You wanted my chair. You wanted my life. Take the gold too. But remember this, you can build a house on lies, but you can never call it a home." I walked out, and this time I didn't look back at the elevator. I walked down the stairs. 22 flights of stairs. Feeling every year of my life falling away with every step. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and shadows. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the fairy lights I had meticulously strung through the trees were still twinkling, a cruel mockery of the celebration that never happened. The house was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping home. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crime scene. I walked through the front door, and the smell of the catering, the expensive hors d'oeuvres, the wine left in half-empty glasses hit me like a physical blow. I spent the first few hours in a state of catatonic shock, moving through the rooms and clearing away the remains of my perfect life. I poured the vintage wine down the kitchen sink, watched the delicate pastries slide into the trash, and felt my heart harden with every movement. The sanctuary was gone. The mahogany table where we had planned our future now looked like a cold, dark altar of sacrifice. Sleep didn't come. I spent the night in the guest room, unable to even look at the door of the master bedroom, where I had spent 2 decades, believing I was loved. Every sound in the house felt like a ghost. I kept expecting to hear Julian's key in the lock, his voice offering a frantic explanation, a plea for forgiveness. But the phone stayed dark, and the door stayed locked. By dawn, the silence had taught me its first lesson. He wasn't coming back to fix what he broke, because he had already moved into the new life he had been building with Sarah. I realized that, while I was mourning a sudden death, they had been celebrating a birth for months. The betrayal wasn't just an act, it was a transition. I was the only one left behind in the ruins of the comfortable habit. Then came the logistical nightmare of a dying marriage. The next few days were a parade of lawyers, cold phone calls, and the agonizing process of dividing a life. Julian sent a courier to pick up his things. He didn't even have the courage to face me. I watched from the window as a stranger hauled boxes of his clothes, his books, his very existence, out of my house. When they were gone, I walked into his closet. It was empty, save for the lingering scent of his cologne, and a single photograph that had fallen behind a shelf, a picture of Maya as a toddler, sitting on his shoulders. I sat on the floor of that empty closet, and finally, I wailed. It wasn't a cry, it was a primal, gut-wrenching sound of a woman being erased. My daughter called from university, her voice trembling as she asked what was happening. Having to tell her that her father had left us for her Aunt Sarah was a second betrayal, a knife I had to twist into my own child's heart. The community, too, became a minefield. People who had admired us now avoided my gaze in the supermarket, or offered whispers of I always thought something was off about her. Their pity felt like ash. I had to learn how to exist without the title of Julian's wife or Sarah's best friend. I had to learn how to make a single cup of coffee, how to sit in a quiet house without feeling like I was waiting for a ghost. I spent hours in the garden, staring at the hydrangeas I had tended so carefully. They were still blooming, indifferent to my world ending. I realized that the house I had built was just a shell. The warmth had been a projection of my own love, a light I had kept burning, while everyone else was already looking for the exit. The aftermath wasn't just about losing a husband. It was about the terrifying realization that I had spent 20 years being the curator of a museum that no one else wanted to visit. The silence of the house began to develop its own texture, a heavy, dusty layer that settled over everything I touched. I found myself walking into rooms with a specific purpose, only to stop in the center of the rug, forgotten by my own mind, paralyzed by the sheer volume of nothing that now filled my life. I started to notice the gaps they had left behind. It wasn't just Julian's presence. It was the way Sarah's laughter used to linger in the hallway, now replaced by a cold draft that seemed to come from the very walls. I went to the kitchen to make tea and realized I didn't know how to cook for one. I looked at the large pots, the serving platters, the sets of 6 and 8, and I felt a wave of nausea. Everything in my home was designed for a crowd, for a family, for a friendship that was a lie. I was an outlier in my own floor plan. I remember the Tuesday the divorce papers arrived. The courier was a young man, barely older than Maya, and he looked at me with such profound awkwardness that I almost wanted to apologize for my tragedy. I took the envelope to the mahogany table. My hands didn't shake this time. They were cold, numb, as if the blood had stopped circulating weeks ago. As I read the dry, legalistic terms, irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution, I realized how easily a life of 22 years could be compressed into 12 pages of black ink. Julian wanted the beach house. He wanted the investment accounts. He offered me the main house, the scene of his crime as, if it were a generous gift. He wanted to buy his way out of the guilt, to leave me the shell of our memories, while he walked away with the liquid assets of our future. I sat there for hours, the sunset casting long, distorted shadows across the paper, realizing that the man who wrote these terms wasn't the man I had married. That man had been replaced by a stranger who negotiated love like a corporate takeover. The most agonizing part was the digital haunting. I knew I should block them. I knew I should delete the apps. But in the middle of the night, driven by a masochistic need to see the face of my pain, I would look at Sarah's social media. She didn't hide. She posted pictures of the diamond pendant against the backdrop of sunsets I should have been seeing. She posted about new beginnings and finding peace in truth. Each post was a deliberate stone thrown at the windows of my soul. I saw a photo of Julian laughing at a dinner table that looked remarkably like mine, with candles and wine, and I realized he wasn't just missing, he was thriving. He had outsourced his midlife crisis to my best friend, and they were building a new world on the foundation I had laid. I felt like a historical footnote, a woman who had been erased from her own biography, while the new leads took their bows. Maya came home for a weekend, and the house felt even emptier with her there. We sat in the living room, the space between us filled with the things we couldn't say. She looked like him. She had his eyes, his way of tilting her head, and every time she looked at me, I saw the ghost of the man who had abandoned us. "Mom, you can't stay here," she whispered, her voice thick with a maturity she shouldn't have to possess yet. "The air here is full of him." She was right. I was haunting myself. I was wandering through the corridors of my past, checking the locks on doors that had already been kicked in. I realized that the aftermath wasn't just about waiting for the pain to stop. It was about realizing that the person I used to be died the night I opened that office door. I had to stop trying to repair the broken glass and start walking away before I bled to death. The transformation didn't happen with a sudden burst of joy, but with the quiet, deliberate act of packed boxes. I decided to sell the house. I realized that I couldn't heal in the same place where I had been poisoned. The day the sold sign went up on the front lawn, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. As I walked through the empty rooms, one last time, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, I didn't see the ghosts of Julian and Sarah anymore. I saw the girl I was before I met them, the girl who loved books, who dreamed of traveling, who had a laugh that didn't need someone else's permission to exist. I was reclaiming her. I moved to a small apartment in the city, a place with large windows and no mahogany tables. It was small, but every inch of it belonged to me. There were no comfortable habits here, only the new. Sharp clarity of independence. I saw Julian one last time, 6 months later. At a neutral coffee shop to sign the final papers, he looked older. The spark I had seen in him that night at the office seemed dimmed, as if the reality of building a life on the ruins of another was more exhausting than he had anticipated. He tried to make small talk, to ask how I was doing with a forced, practiced kindness. I really looked at him, and I felt nothing. No rage, no longing, not even the sting of betrayal. I realized that I hadn't just lost a husband. I had been liberated from a man who was capable of destroying a 20-year sanctuary without a second thought. I hope it was worth it, Julian, I said, not as a curse, but as a simple observation. He didn't answer. He just looked down at his coffee, the silence between us no longer a bridge, but a vast, uncrossable ocean. I signed the papers and walked out into the sunlight, feeling the wind on my face for the first time in years. Sarah tried to call me once. I saw her name on the screen, and for a moment my heart hammered. But I didn't pick up. I didn't need to hear her justifications, her apologies, or her complaints about how hard it is to live with a man who has a history he's trying to forget. I deleted the number and blocked her, not out of anger, but out of a need for hygiene. Some wounds don't need to be reopened. They need to be scarred over so the skin can become tougher. I spent my evenings on my new balcony, watching the city lights. I started painting again, something I had given up because Julian thought it was messy. My canvases were filled with vibrant, chaotic colors, a stark contrast to the muted, perfect tones of my old life. I was messy. I was broken. But I was finally real. The ending of my story isn't a reunion or a new romance. It's the sound of me making a single cup of coffee in the morning and enjoying the silence. It's the way Maya looks at me now, not with pity, but with a new kind of respect for the mother who didn't just survive, but reinvented herself. My home isn't a building anymore. It's the space inside my own ribs. I am no longer the architect of someone else's world. I am the inhabitant of my own. The friend who stole my home did me a strange, cruel favor. She took the prison and left me the key. And as I watched the sun rise over the city, I realized that for the first time in 22 years, I am not waiting for anyone to come home. I am already here.